Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. It's Friday, July 21st. On tap this week, climate change is the new normal. Heat waves throughout the Northern Hemisphere are baking streets, cities, countries, and land all over the country. What does it mean for the future of agriculture, for the future of international politics, and for life in our cities? Then we'll take a look at Russia suspending the grain deal that allowed Ukraine to ship wheat and grains in large quantities out through the Black Sea and onto the international market. And finally, China's economic growth is stalling, finally catching up on the post-COVID openness, and there's all kinds of implications of that. Here to talk about these issues are Philip Stevens, contributing editor of the Financial Times, Carla Anne Robbins, senior fellow of the Council on Foreign Relations and formerly of the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, and Bobby Ghosh, columnist at Bloomberg Opinion. Hi, all. Great to see you. Thanks for being here. Philip, let's start with you. Just incredible stories when you as we said, except in Chicago, where I am, in London, where you are in the Northern Hemisphere, it is baking 26 days in a row in Phoenix, Arizona, of over 40 degree, over 105 degree temperature, 110 degree temperatures. It's true throughout Southern Europe. It's true in Asia. We're not made for this, and yet we now need to accept that this seems to be the new normal. Every summer is just going to be hotter. What does it all mean, Philip, for how we're dealing with the world, and what do we do about it?
Well, I think the first thing, and as you say, this is absolutely extraordinary. There are very few places in the Northern Hemisphere now which have escaped this. I mean, London being one, and Chicago, but who knows what's going to happen next month. But I think what we're learning, or we should have learned now, is that we've seen climate change as a future threat. It's now a present reality. We're facing climate change now. When the world came together and said, look, we've got to limit this, they talked about the target. The UN target was to limit the rise in temperatures globally to 1.5 degrees centigrade. Well, we're over 1 degree centigrade. Some people say 1.1, some people say 1.25. And what we're learning at the same time is how this rise in temperatures supercharges other weather events. It's not just that it's getting hotter, it's the way it gets hotter. It exaggerates, supercharges the other weather events, the high pressure patterns and other things. So we've got these extreme temperatures. In Athens, they've had to close the Acropolis. It's too hot for visitors to go there. You've got wildfires in Italy, in Spain, in China. It's been, I think, over 50 places, over 50 degrees centigrade. So this is with us, and in Europe, which tends, I think, the impact has been felt, I think, more quickly than in some other places in the world. People are talking about the Sahara advancing up from Africa into the south of Europe, and it's begun to feel like that. So this is it. This is, climate change isn't something that, might happen down the road. It's happening, and we have to respond to it. Are governments and businesses responding? Well, the answer is yes. You've seen in the United States, the Inflation Reduction Act, big subsidies for green energies. In Europe, there's a net zero target. There is movement in international finance to begin to shift funds towards poorer countries so they can set realistic carbon targets. But what's clear and obvious is that we're not acting fast enough. Business is also responding. If you look at investment now in alternative, in energy sources, renewable energy sources, It's now higher if you look at it globally, increasing at a faster rate than that in carbon fuels. But it's not, again, it's not fast enough. We're heading way over 1.5. At the same time, so there's going to have to be another big push. And at the same time, we've got to start building in resilience. I mean, one summer, 2 summers, you can cope with extreme temperatures where everyone basically in some places has to stay inside during the daylight hours. But you can't cope with that over a protracted period. So we're going to have to think about how we live. We're going to have to think about our agriculture. I mean, in Italy at the moment, there are going to be severe shortages of dairy products because they're simply not getting the milk. Agricultural patterns across the world are shifting. Desertification is pushing more and more people, particularly in Africa, out of Africa towards Europe. So you have the migration flows. So, we sort of, as we said, we know that climate change is a problem, but we've thought about it as tomorrow's problem. Hey, the message is it's today's problem.
Yeah, Carla, it seems to me Philip has it exactly right that we really need a change of attitude, a change of mind, that something about climate change is you combat it in order to prevent it from happening. It's too late for that. It's here when you go to the beach, which normally is a place where you cool off when it's hot. But you go to the beach in Florida, you can't walk across the sand because it's too hot. And when you finally get to the water, you're taking literally a bath. 92 degrees Fahrenheit is what the weather is off of Miami. It's stunning when you think about that. So it's here, it's now. How are our politics, both internationally and at home, ready to take on the challenge of dealing with the reality of climate change while still trying to prevent even worse from happening? Or are we just too late?
Well, for the longest time, as Philip said, it seemed like it was in the future, and economic interests transcend. And certainly developing countries said that we had created the problem. They weren't going to, you solve it. We have to keep, and that's his job. Secretary of State. Obviously, Biden thinks it's important. As Philip said, the Inflation Reduction Act, lots of money that's going in there. But what do the Republicans want to do? They want to take it back. So Kerry's in China. It's incredibly hot in China, and he's pitching this intensely. And one would hope that they have the clear demonstration effect. And they're still making the argument that they're a developing country and they got to open more coal plants. They are the number one emitter at this point. So Kerry hoped that he'd made progress, and he came back and didn't make a lot of progress. And as he was going away, first of all, while he was there, they broke a new record in Beijing, 4 weeks over 95 degrees, which is pretty extraordinary. And as he was leaving, Xi gave a talk to the Communist Party and said, "We'll decide. No one's going to tell us how to do it." And they have made almost no progress since Paris. And if the Chinese, if the Indians, who have to make really basic economic choices here, development on one side versus, the reality, we can't do this without China and India. And there's very little sense, even though they themselves probably are suffering far more than we are, and even more, and more than Europe is.
Bobby, it seems that's right. And this is, if there is a problem that is truly global in nature, that it cannot be addressed by one country alone. The idea that don't tell us what to do on climate change, we will do, quote, ourselves, whatever that means, as Xi Jinping said, Carla referenced. What does that mean for how we deal with this issue, not just about preventing down the road, but today?
I mean, when Xi Jinping says that, when Modi says that, we know what they mean. They'll put up more coal plants. And in Xi Jinping's case, not only put up more coal plants in China, but finance and encourage the building of coal plants across the global south with Chinese funding and sometimes Chinese technology. If you don't mind, I'd like to take a step back from the discussion to examine there's a civilizational aspect to this. Our civilization, and I speak across the world, is not built for these temperatures, is not built for this kind of weather. And that applies across every aspect of our civilization. The way we build our houses, the architecture of them, the way we design our cities and our streets, cities that expect very little rainfall, build in a certain way, and those cities are now being inundated with vast amounts of rainfall, and they're not ready for that. Philip mentioned cuisine. The Italians are struggling with cheese. I was in Italy a couple of months ago. The price of olive oil is off the charts because Spain, which produces most of the olive oil that the Italians consume, they don't like to admit it, but that's the fact, is suffering from enormous drought and therefore can't produce as much olive oil. And the Italians aren't getting their olive oil. We don't need to indulge in cultural stereotypes or cliches to think about what that means if the Italians can't get enough olive oil. All the way across the board, our social mores, the way we think about politics, the way we think about human interaction, the way we even think about race, is to some degree informed by the conditions in which these mores have developed over centuries. Those are breaking down very, very fast. And so our politicians, our leadership, our bankers, our companies have to struggle not only with the sort of immediate sort of tactile impact on bottom lines and on vote banks, but also what all of this is doing to us as a civilization. And that throws up all kinds of new challenges and new risks. Again, when I was in Italy, there was a serious television program, very serious television program, that was given over to the discussion about whether it would be possible for the Swedes and the Norwegians to grow olives. And I remember giggling about it at the time, but it's not funny if you're an Italian. I coincidentally was in Oslo a couple of months after that. I remember asking some Norwegian friends about this. They were taking it seriously. And they were thinking, can we change the entire profile of what we grow and therefore the nature of our economy? And then what will it take to grow these things? Where can we find the labor? Can we find labor from within white European societies? Do we need to get labor from Africa, from Asia? Can our political systems bear that level of immigration? There's so much to consider. There's so much. I'm sorry to be so alarmist about this, but how can we not be alarmed? It's not just a matter of air conditioning. It's a matter of conditioning the way our civilization behaves and thinks.
Go ahead, Philip. Yeah.
Just one word back to the sort of geopolitics of this. One of the things that's happened since the Russian attack and invasion of Ukraine is that there's been a lot of hand-wringing among Western nations about why the global South, the rest of the world, isn't fully on board with the Western and the American, the European case against Russia. Well, for me, and we just heard as well that, the Chinese are selling coal plants, to countries in Africa. We devised the international financial institutions after the Second World War in order to rebuild a lot of the world, to rebuild Europe, but also to spread development. Seems to me that the sort of geopolitical imperative now is that we re-engineer the international financial institutions to say, we in the West, but the institutions have to find a way to get to these countries who are building coal-fired plants and whatever, to get the money for them to invest in renewable energies instead. And this, for me, seems to be the way for the West to sort of win back friends, but also serve the cause of limiting global warming.
There's a lot of conversation now that the World Bank has to take the lead on this, and there's more of a chance because there's a new president at the World Bank. I mean, David Malpass would never play that role. In fact, he left precisely because he suddenly sounded like a climate denier. but that would be a scale of investment, and it's that so far the World Bank has not been able to do. One would hope that they would take the lead, and that's been a very big call.
Yeah, it's a scale of a problem that we haven't faced.
Yeah. No, I think, and what I think makes this so urgent and difficult is we've always thought that the long-term scale of dealing with ways to try to try to prevent the rise of temperatures was already big. But I think Bobby's point, I mean, just Bobby building on all of on Philip's point that this is now the new normal, is we also need a civilizational readjustment today, and just look at our cities, which don't have places for water to go. There is no green space. They just get hotter and hotter and hotter, and they build on each other, and it makes it worse and worse. That's a problem of, frankly, of yesterday, not even of today. And how we interact between societies and within societies are huge problems. Even as we're trying to say, okay, we need a few $1 trillion investments over the next 5 to 10 years in the global South to generate the renewable power capacity for these rapidly urbanizing societies. It's a massive change, and when you think about what our day-to-day culture and our day-to-day preoccupation is, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, you do wonder which planet are we living on and what's happening to the planet in and of itself. So, if there's one salutary fact coming out of this, is the realization that climate change isn't a problem for tomorrow; it's a problem for yesterday, and we better figure out what to do today and how to change today.
Yeah. Although I will say that there's one political party in the United States that does not accept that reality. And with the debt deal was what they wanted to do was roll back the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think when you see the political campaign, that is going to be, I think, climate denial, or at least let's not spend our money on this. We have more immediate concerns. They have not accepted the fact that it's here, even though you go outside and you see it immediately.
Well, I wonder
when you mention, China saying we're going to do it our way, this is what, George W. Bush was telling Tony Blair 15 years ago, when Blair was saying, look, don't pull out of, the climate change accord. And that is a real danger if we get an administration back in the US that wants to leave. Although, hopefully, the momentum from industry may be such that it will be politically difficult for any administration to sort of pull the plug, as it were.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that might have an influence on the political realities is all of us are voters, and all of us are experiencing that climate change is today, not tomorrow. So it's not just thinking about the Greta Thunberg's running around and doing their protests in schools and universities. We're feeling it every day. We can't take a plane where we want to go because of the weather. You can't go outside, or your basement gets flooded, or you can't even go to the beach because it's too hot. So you're starting to feel it today, and the hope is that everyone starts to adjust to that reality. It's a big hope, but worth focusing on. One of the impacts, Carla, of course, is agriculture. And agriculture is in the front of geopolitical news with the suspension by Russia of the grain deal, which allowed Ukraine to ship its grain out of the country through the Black Sea. And we're seeing bumper year crops in certain parts of the world, including Russia, but not in other parts of the world. And climate, of course, is what determines a good measure how much wheat and grain gets grown, where and how. Bring us up to date about what the Russians have been doing and why now suspend the deal that seemed to be working, at least when it comes to feeding the world.
So, Putin's played chicken with the deadline, on this ever since it was signed a year ago. And people weren't really sure that he was not going to once again complain and then sign. But this time, as the clock ticked down, he refused even to take calls from Erdogan and from the UN Secretary General, who've been the big brokers on it. And then to prove that he was really serious, the Russian Defense Ministry warned that any ships sailing to Ukraine's ports would be considered hostile. And then they started bombarding the ports in Ukraine, and they destroying thousands of tons of grain and corn, and destroying port infrastructure, holding live fire exercises, scaring the you-know-what out of everybody. And the wheat future prices in Chicago, Evo, which had really stabilized because of the grain deal, spiked. They were like 12% by Thursday. But this morning, they seem to be moderating somewhat. They were down 2.5% when I looked at it. Yes, geeking out on Chicago grain futures. As you said, there are bumper crops somewhere. I don't think, I think the general feeling people have is that it's not going to be as bad as it was after the war started, because Australia, the US, Argentina, and Russia, which has been doing really well as it takes more and more of Ukraine's market share, will somewhat make up the difference. So the wheat prices won't be totally off the charts. But countries are going to suffer because of it, because it's going to be more expensive. They're going to have to scramble. They're going to have to pay more for shipping because of further distances. And a lot of the countries that Philip was talking about, the ones that were sitting on the fence, that are leaning somewhat toward Russia, are the ones that are going to suffer the most. So whether they put some pressure on Putin, we'll see. Why is Putin doing this? There's lots of explanations. It's really hard to get inside his head. One of the explanations that I'm hearing from people in Washington is that it has nothing to do with his complaints, because they went out of their way to resolve his problem with the agricultural bank that he said he wanted re-swifted, put back onto SWIFT. He wouldn't take anybody's calls every time they came up with a solution. The explanation is that this is another attack on civilian infrastructure, another way to squeeze Ukraine. And it has the further benefit of giving them a more market share. And last year, they had the best year of exports. They were up 10% over their record. And so they get a dual benefit. They squeeze Ukraine and they get even richer.
Squeezing Ukraine, getting richer. Bobby, is that the play that's being played? I mean, of course, if wheat prices go up, you get even more from what you're selling. That's what they've been trying to do with oil. It was one of the few things they're making money on. And they need money in order to maintain their capacity to invest in the war and to maintain the war. Is this the game? Is it something else? Is it him trying to regain the initiative domestically after really a pretty bad month, where he had an internal mutiny that doesn't seem to have in any way strengthened him in the eyes of the people in Russia, or certainly the elites? How do you see it?
Well, I think all of the above is the answer. He's with Putin given his position, he has to thread several needles at the same time, and this is one way to do it. I agree with Carla. I don't think wheat prices worldwide will go up, not least because it is in Putin's interest to discount wheat to those countries in the global south who have either backed Russia or sat on the fence. He needs them to continue to sit on the fence, or if possible, get off the fence in his side. And so he will, my colleagues at Bloomberg have been picking up some reporting that suggests that lots of African countries have been reassured that prices will be kept down, that they will be given very discounted prices. So at the end of the day, Russia may not actually, if the discounting is as deep as, let's say, it's done with oil, then Russia may not get a huge revenue benefit, but there is a political benefit, a geopolitical benefit to keeping the world from sort of fully backing Ukraine. So, yeah, I don't think wheat prices will necessarily go up. Ukraine has a big problem with full granaries there, and the risk of just allowing all those grains to rot. The land routes, the alternative routes to get that wheat out are not really, cannot handle that kind of capacity. And so we'll have to see whether the Europeans can respond in the way that they did with their gas supplies and their fuel needs, whether the Europeans can apply the same amount of energy and investment into improving Ukraine's ability to get its grain out in directions that Russia cannot interdict. The Russians have warned that they will, or at least suggested very sort of boldly, that they will consider any shipping that, whether it's carrying grain or not, any shipping going through the waters that it regards as its sort of preserve, that those will be assumed that those ships are carrying supplies to help the Ukrainian war effort, which means, I mean, the implication is that they will sink some ships or grab them and take them over. That cat has to be belled. Somebody will at some point either stray into those waters or deliberately go into those waters to see whether the Russians are bluffing. Then there is the sort of joker in the pack, which is so often the case. Turkey's President Erdogan, who was very instrumental in making that grain deal possible in the first instance, he has made Putin very upset by a number of different things, including sort of suggesting that Ukraine should join NATO. So is he going to be able to broker a second deal? If not him, then whom? These are all questions that are all up in the air, and I think all of this uncertainty, given his very nature, all of this uncertainty is what Putin wants and what he thinks he can exploit and benefit from.
Philip, I think the way that Bobby rightly puts it is sort of Putin being the tactician here, of course, not the strategist as usual, to sort of create uncertainty all over the place, play one game with the Turks and another game with the UN and a third game with the Africans and a fourth game with the Ukrainians, hoping that in some ways it will resolve itself, or at least he gets the ultimate benefit. The European foreign ministers got together yesterday to discuss how to help the Ukrainians, because in the end, everything that is good for that the Russians are doing is not good for Ukraine, even if global markets are fine. And the reality is that Ukraine is being squeezed, and its market is being squeezed as long as the grain can't go out on the ports, which are now suffering daily and nightly strikes. How do the Europeans look at this? And they are, of course, continue to be worried. They know that if Ukraine doesn't have the money, it's got to come from somewhere to sustain the war and the economy, and it will have to come from the Europeans. So what was that discussion like, and how do you see it?
Well, I think there is obviously that concern, and I think a realization that, yeah, as you say, someone's got to pay. As far as Putin's tactics are concerned, though, there is another way of looking at this. We tend often to think about how Putin operates these sort of strategies and tactics and plays and games and whatever. Another way of looking at it is to say Putin's got nowhere else to go at the moment. Putin's had a really bad time. He's had a mutiny, if you like, within his own forces. He's losing the Wagner forces now from Ukraine. And although the Ukrainian offensive is slow and is taking longer, Russia is on the defensive. So, things don't look great for Putin at the moment. So what he's doing, I mean, I've heard at least one senior European say this, is he's trying to show that he can still operate, that he can still, whatever problems he's got, he can cause problems elsewhere, and hence stopping the grain. But whether this actually works in the sort of medium to long term is questionable, because one, as Bobby said, we are, and I think some work's going to be done. We are going to have to start getting grain out from Ukraine overland. I don't think the Russians can subsidize all their sales to all these developing countries there. But it's not just the developing countries of Africa, it's medium income countries as well. So Russia is going to lose support, although what it hopes to do, again, another diplomat said to me, is what it hopes to do, and to the extent there is a tactic or a strategy in it, is to get some of these countries to put pressure on the West to ease some of the sanctions on Russia. So, what he's looking for is there a deal that says, okay, I go back, I allow the grain to flow again, but I get something elsewhere. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think it's going to be offered. But I think this is as much an act of desperation on the Russians' part, on Putin's part, as a clear tactical strategy tactic to get Russia back on a winning footing. Because it's however hard it's for the Ukrainians at the moment, the Russians are on a losing footing at the moment, and Putin himself, who, as someone NATO put it to me, Putin doesn't know who to trust and who he's strong enough to fire, and that's not a good position to be in if you're a dictator.
So
I think that's certainly true. Yeah.
So the Americans are really determined to get that grain out, and they're determined to get it out through Europe, and they're spending a lot of time trying to figure that out. Talking to the Europeans precisely, and they look at it the same way they look at oil. Is that Putin thought he could hold the world up with oil, and he didn't succeed at that, and that they are determined to prove this with grain as well. If they, if it can't get him to back off, and they're hoping potentially that, that the Chinese who also get the grain, or the Indians who also get the grain, or the Africans who get the grain can put some pressure on him. But if that doesn't work, they're going to get that grain out, because it is half of the hard currency earnings for Ukraine, but more than anything else, to make clear that he can't hold the world hostage. He couldn't do it for oil, and he can't do it with grain.
Yeah, no, I think, and that's why, I've been re-upping some stuff that I wrote a year ago about escorting and thinking about naval escorts for Ukrainian ships. I mean, remember that we tend to look at the Black Sea as somehow a Russian lake. It's not. It's a Turkey, of course, Bulgaria, Romania are NATO states, which are littoral states. And have control. You could fly. You could ship the grain through Ukrainian, Romanian, Bulgarian, and Turkish territorial waters in order to get out. You could provide naval escorts and force the Russians to escalate.
The key thing there is what is insurance. What the shippers need is insurance, and private insurance now won't operate it. So whether governments can basically come in and say we will insure vessels, I think is a big question, not on your point here.
Yeah, and I think those are the kinds of discussions. And by the way, I think those kind of discussions, the more serious they become, as I think they did last year, the more likely it is that there will be pressure to re-up a deal, to get Erdogan the space to figure out a way to get Moscow to recommit. And or the UN General Assembly, Secretary General, whomever. But I think Carla's point, you need to get the grain out, it needs to be, and then thinking about the strategies, of course, overland, but we know the limits of overland, really through the Black Sea, and figuring out how to do that as a means also to increase pressure on the diplomacy, maybe another way in which Putin's short-sightedness and desperation may be tested. I mean, I think we're in a period where I used to be much more cautious on this. I'm willing to test Putin a little bit more, given the difficulty he's in, and force him to escalate and decide that that's what he wants to do, rather than us being unwilling to test that proposition. But of course, we're sitting in our living rooms, not in the Oval Office or in 10 Downing Street or in the Élysée to have to make those decisions. So it's easy for us to do that. Speaking about good places to meet, Henry Kissinger was in Beijing. It looks like that Xi Jinping and his government would love nothing more than Kissinger and Nixon back, in order to have the kind of positive economic relations with the United States that they seemingly enjoyed in the early 1970s. Although it takes a lot of rewriting history to say that was a better time than it is today. But clearly, China, Bobby, is facing some very serious problems economically. They are, growth in the last quarter was less than 1%. Which is below the annual goal that they have. There's some really big structural issues, and then they have this geopolitical competition that seems to be driving the Chinese in ways that isn't clear that they know how to respond. I mean, if all you can do is meet with Kissinger, Musk, and Bill Gates, which is what they seem to be doing, and meeting with U.S. officials and basically having them go home empty-handed, you do wonder, what are they trying to do and how are they trying to solve their problems?
Well, the Kissinger, Musk, and meeting with business leaders, that's quite a transparent move to try and get these people to come back to the U.S. and put pressure on the Biden administration, go a little easier on the Chinese and bring down some of the sanctions and tariffs that have been placed, particularly in semiconductors. I don't think that's particularly going to cut it. But I think they're also a sign that Xi Jinping recognizes that he has a very serious problem on his hands. I mean, the Chinese economy is meant to grow 5% this year. Now, sounds like a lot compared to many other countries, but it's not really 5%. It's actually much less because it's 5% compared to last year. Last year was an exceptionally bad year. The COVID zero rules were only sort of relaxed late in the year. So my colleagues at Bloomberg on the news side, on the economics team, crunch the numbers, and they figure that if you adjust for all of that, actual growth for China this year is something like 3%, which is closer to the worldwide pattern. That's not good enough for a country the size of China. There are all kinds of things coming together in China to create a perfect storm. The real estate boom, the sort of big bubble of property, seems finally to be deflating, if not puncturing. That makes ordinary Chinese who've got a lot of investment in their homes or in their sort of in real estate. That makes them very nervous about spending. So they're not spending, which means spending is coming down. They're not traveling as much as was hoped once the revenge travel post-COVID phenomenon. That's not yet really begun from the Chinese. And all of this has a sort of vicious cycle effect because it's kind of slowing down Chinese consumption. It's slowing down Chinese growth. Now, if this was something that was just contained to China, then that would be one problem. But of course, that's not the case. World's second largest economy. It's the old cliche: if China sneezes, we all catch a cold. And so sort of across particularly the global south, where the connection to the Chinese economy is very, very tight. This is a serious problem. If China is not buying because its manufacturing and its industrial growth rate has slowed down, if China is not buying as much sort of minerals and agricultural produce as it does, that's extremely bad news for Brazil. That's very bad news for Australia. If China's not buying, if Chinese are not feeling comfortable about buying the latest phone or the latest bauble, the latest electronic product, that's bad news for South Korea. That's bad news for Taiwan. And the absence of Chinese tourists is bad news for all kinds of countries that depend on Chinese tourism. Europe springs immediately to mind. So, Xi Jinping knows that all of these problems are hurtling down or may already be upon his shoulders right now. And so he's having to grapple with all of that. His communications to the rest of the world are hard enough to judge at the best of times. It's even harder now because his foreign minister has been MIA for weeks and weeks and weeks, and we don't even know what's going on with the foreign minister. So I think this combination of all of these economic crises sort of arriving at the same time, this is something Xi Jinping has not had to deal with before. This is, I would suggest, an even greater crisis than COVID was for China and the Chinese economy. And we don't know how Xi Jinping responds to a crisis of this order. Does he sort of hunker down and try to find economic solutions? Or does he do what nationalist populists tend to do in these situations, which is try and distract his country and his people with sort of other crises that can take their attention away from their economic problems? The short answer is we don't know. He's never been here before. We don't know what he does when he gets there.
I think that puts it all in the right perspective. And Philip, I mean, part of the problem is there isn't a clear economic way out of the problem that Bobby has put in front of us. 25% of GDP is tied into the real estate market, which is not doing well. Consumer confidence is low, and exports, although are also losing steam, as is foreign investment. And so it's not like he has the ability to control, other than perhaps stimulating the economy through public spending, although that means more debt on their cases as well. It's just, it isn't clear he has a clear economic path and out of the mess that China is facing, which therefore might increase the chances of a nationalistic geopolitical path. How do you see it?
Well, I think I'd say two things. One, you're absolutely right. The predicament now is a very difficult one. Two, I'd say this was bound to happen. We had this sort of sense in the West that the China rules the world syndrome, I used to call it, that China just could keep on growing for 10% or whatever, it's 7, 8, 9, 10% for as long as it wanted to. Actually, there are rules of economics. There are things called economic cycles that we in the West know well, and they apply to rising countries as well, rising economies. There are rules that say if the state, or in the case of China, takes control of some of the most dynamic industries and says, we're going to regulate and run them, you squeeze out economic dynamism, you squeeze out entrepreneurship and innovation. And that's what Xi Jinping has been doing in the last few years, and we're now beginning to see the effects. China also has a demographic problem. I mean, there was always this question, will it get rich before it gets old? Well, it's certainly getting old now. It's a lot richer. But, we begin to see there's this real possibility that China, falls into what, historically has been called the middle income trap, where, countries, rise very, very quickly, but then get stuck. And that's where we are now. And I think with China, with the, I think a state or a party state-led approach to economics is just not going to work in China. It may deliver 3, 4, 5% growth over a prolonged period, but that's not enough for China. So I think there is a danger, or there is also the possibility, I suppose, that China will change course economically at some point. At some point, it will say we have to, the party and the state have to pull back a bit. We need some of these sort of billionaire Chinese entrepreneurs to get things moving again. But in the short term, I think, China's going to be in the economic doldrums. And as you say, there is no obvious route out of it.
Yeah, and it seems to me, Carla, that poses a real problem for the United States, because on the one hand, we have a tendency to paint our enemies as 10 feet tall, and economically, and as a result, the rest of society, that probably isn't the case. And yet, if there is no economic alternative to trying to figure out how you mobilize the society, then nationalism and dangerous behavior becomes more likely. And how do you prevent, deter, deal with that? Seems to me a particularly difficult challenge to a country that is not really good at nuance when it comes to engaging the world. How does this play out?
So are you talking about the United States not really good at nuance and engaging the world, or China?
No. Well, I mean, the Chinese aren't either, for that matter. But maybe that's it. Just isn't our strength, right?
Right. So is some good news in this. The Chinese seem, because they're in tough economic straits, more willing to talk to Americans, and the Biden administration, after sort of cranking itself up into a total China frenzy, is also more interested in talking to the Chinese, which is why there are Chinese officials coming to the U.S. and U.S. officials going to China. The one area where there hasn't been any communication has been in the national security and defense realm. And that's the thing you really got to worry about because of unintended conflict. And that's a frightening thing. The Chinese ambassadors, did actually go and meet with the Pentagon official, the one in Washington. But that's it. There's still, Kissinger got to meet with the Chinese defense minister, but Lloyd Austin has yet to meet with him. And so I am somewhat more reassured, despite what you're hearing from the Hill, that the Biden administration wants to crank things down a little bit, particularly at a period of time, as Bobby said, that we don't know. And as Philip said, we don't know that the Chinese could become more nationalistic to divert people's attention. But until you have more communication in the national security realm, the potential for unintended conflict or intentional conflict is really high.
Yeah, that's the absence of communication certainly is a big issue, and if we have to do it through Henry Kissinger, that may have advantages, but it's not the best way to communicate. I agree.
It does seem strange, though, that only 2 or 3 years ago we were saying the big problem is China's growing too fast and it's going to overtake the US the day after tomorrow. And we're now sitting here saying, actually, there's a big problem here. China isn't growing fast enough. So, somewhere between those two, there has to be some maybe happy medium where we can try and strike out and have this sort of relationship which is competitive rather than confrontational.
And that indeed, I think, is the hope that we figure out that Goldilocks way of trying to get into that situation. But Philip Stevens, Carla Robbins, Bobby Ghosh, as always, a real pleasure to have this conversation. We went deep, we went far, we went civilizational. We may not have solved all of the problems, but at least I think we have enhanced everyone's understanding. And I thank all of you for that. And I thank you for tuning in this week for another edition of World Review. We will be back next week. Until then, have a fantastic weekend.
Thank you.